Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to the Unitarian Congregation of Mendon and Uxbridge. My name is Matthew Marion. I'm going to be starting off today with How High the Moon. Thank you.
Good morning to all of you who are joining us this morning. Rather beautiful summer morning. As we gather to be together, to seek truth, to seek wisdom, come together this morning. In the recent history of this church, we never met in this room during the summer. The reason for that is probably obvious. We have lots of beautiful windows which let the sun in and let the room warm up. I call your attention to our candle that we use for lighting candles of joys and sorrows. You'll notice that it is no longer a straight candle. It has bent over, and I would not be surprised if I came in here some morning and found nothing but a pile of green wax at the base of the candle. But today is a beautiful and cool Sunday morning. A good time for us to be together. A good time for us to seek truth, to seek wisdom, make those changes in this world which we are able and called to do. Here we begin our time together this morning with the words of Annie Dillard. We are here to abet creation and to witness to it, to notice each other's beautiful face and complex nature, so that creation need not play to an empty house.
All right.
It is our custom as we gather to kindle a flame in our midst, a flame long the symbol of the presence of that which is whole and holy, a flame the symbol of wisdom and of knowledge. And we kindle this flame in a shared cup, a chalice, because as we gather seeking to be one with each other. We gather seeking to find that which makes our lives and those about us whole and holy. We gather seeking wisdom and knowledge that our lives may be richer and that our effect on the environment and on the world may be greater. I invite those of you who know the words to join in our affirmation. Love is the spirit of this church, and service its law. This is our great covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another. Normally, at this time in our service, I would kindle this candle and invite those of you here to come forward lighting a candle and sharing with us, if you wish, your joys, your sorrows, your milestones. Since we are working virtually at this point, I invite those of you who wish to share joys, sorrows, or milestones to do so either by email or by the chat if you are participating in that. I decided today to tell you a little bit of a story by Jenny Cohen. I want to start by telling you a little bit about the process of amending the U.S. Constitution. For the Constitution to be amended, both the U.S. Senate and House of Representatives are required to file a joint resolution, which then must be passed by two-thirds vote in each of those houses. And then it would be sent out to each state, and it must be ratified by two-thirds of the, by three-quarters of the states. And once that has happened, it becomes part of the Constitution. Jenny Cohen writes about the events at the ratification in the last state necessary, Tennessee. Minutes after Tennessee ratified the 19th Amendment, essentially ending American women's decades-long quest for the right to vote, a young man with a red rose pinned to his lapel fled to the attic of the state capitol and camped out there until the maddening crowds downstairs had dispersed. Some say he crept onto a third-floor ledge to escape an angry mob of anti-suffragist lawmakers threatening to rough him up. The date was August 18, 1920, and the man was Harry Byrne, a 24-year-old representative from East Tennessee, who 2 years earlier had become the youngest member of the state legislature. The red rose signified his opposition to the Proposition 19 Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, which stated that the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. By the summer of 1920, 35 states had ratified the measure, bringing it to one vote short of ratifying the measure. In Tennessee, it had sailed through the Senate, but stalled in the House of Representatives, prompting thousands of pro and anti-suffrage activists to descend on Nashville. If Byrne and his colleagues voted in favor, the 19th Amendment would pass the final hurdle on its way to adoption. After weeks of intense lobbying and debate within the Tennessee legislature, a motion to table the amendment was defeated with a 48-48 tie. The Speaker called for the measure for a ratification vote. To the dismay of many of the suffragists who had packed into the Capitol with their yellow roses, sashes, and signs, it seemed certain that the final roll call vote would maintain the deadlock. But that morning, Harry Byrne, who until that time had fallen squarely into the anti-suffragist camp, received a note from his mother. Phoebe Ensminger Byrne, known to her family and friends as Miss Feb. In it, she had written, "Hurrah and vote for suffrage. Don't keep them in doubt. I noticed some of the speeches against. They were bitter. I have been watching to see how you stood, but have not noticed anything yet." She ended the missive with a rousing endorsement of the great suffragist leader Carrie Chapman Catt, imploring her son to, quote, "be a good boy and help Mrs. Catt put the rat in ratification." Still sporting his red boutonniere, but clutching his mother's letter, Burns said, so quickly that it took his fellow legislators a few minutes to register his unexpected response. With that single syllable, he extended the vote to the women of America and ended half a century of tireless campaigning by generations of suffragists, including Susan B. Anthony, Alice Paul, Lucy Burns, and of course, Mrs. Catt. To get the word male in effect out of the Constitution cost the women of this country 52 years of pauseless campaign. Catt wrote in her 1923 book, Women's Suffrage and Politics. She said that had been a 52-year fight. He also invoked the fury of his red rose carrying peers while presumably avoiding that of his mother, which may very well have been the more daunting of the two. The next day, Byrne defended his last-minute reversal in a speech to the Assembly. For the first time, he publicly expressed his personal support of universal suffrage, declaring, "I believe that we had a moral and legal right to ratify." But he also made no secret of Miss Febb's influence and her crucial role in the story of women's rights in the United States. Quote, "I know that a mother's advice is always safest for her boy to follow," he explained. "And my mother wanted me to vote for ratification."
This will be Richard Rogers, my favorite thing.
I invite us to pause for a moment, to hold in our hearts and minds those people who for generations have sought to make of this country and of this world a better place. Those who have stood against powers to make their cause reality. I ask us to think of how we, you and I, can join the ranks of those who in the past have sacrificed, have demonstrated, have fought for the rights of all people, for the rights of the environment, for those things which make of this world a more beautiful, a more wonderful place. Amen. As I think all of you probably know, last Tuesday was the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, which granted women at least, and this is perhaps the most important word, white women, the right to vote. It was the end of a long and difficult struggle, having taken decades of agitation and protest, beginning back in the middle of the 19th century. Have you looked at the pictures of some of the leaders of the suffrage movement? The pictures of people like Susan B. Anthony, Carrie Chapman Catt, Lucretia Mott, Lucy Burns. They're old. Most of the original leaders of the movement did not live to see the amendment enacted. The activity began in the middle of the 19th century when many women who sought the right to vote for themselves realized that that was only one of a number of important questions. And so they joined with abolitionists to end slavery, to hold the country together. But over the years, it was not just old women who fought the cause for equal voting rights. The ones that we see probably had begun as young women. And in the beginning of the 20th century, the cause was joined by many young women, college students, and other young radicals. And much of my service today will be about one of them. Beginning in the early 1800s, women organized petitions and picketed to win the right to vote. but it was more than half a century before they got, from the time that the first act to amend the Constitution was introduced in Congress in 1878 until 1920, when it was ratified. Champions of voting rights for women worked tirelessly. But part of their problem was that their goals for achieving their way varied. Some of them had achieved women's suffrage in states. 9 Western states had adopted women's suffrage legislation by 1912. And in many cases, those state laws were more powerful for women than the national amendment. Other people, rather than demonstrating and seeking legislative changes, went to the courts. Some favored public demonstrations, parades, silent vigils, hunger strikes. And no matter which way they tried, many of them met fierce resistance. Opponents were heckled and jailed, and sometimes physically abused. A group of more than 20 women, after a silent protest, were jailed, and when they went on a hunger strike, tubes were inserted in their throats and food poured into them. It was a difficult time. But in the 1900s, 1920, the 19th Amendment guaranteed some Americans, at least American women, the right to vote. It had been a long and difficult struggle. It took decades, but it was finally law. We think of many of those older women, but I'd like to talk to you today about a young woman, a woman named Inez Milholland, who was born in Brooklyn, New York, the eldest child in a well-to-do family. Her father worked both in New York and in London, so she spent enough time in London that throughout her life she spoke with a slight British accent. She spent enough time in London that she did her high school, what we would call high school education there, but wanted to return to the United States to attend Vassar College, a college for women. Vassar, however, would not accept her British diploma, even though it was from a school far better than many schools in the United States from which they accepted students. So she had to spend an extra year in the United States to get a diploma that they would accept for her admission. A women's college. One would expect it to be liberal, to support women's rights. But according to the Vassar Encyclopedia, at the time that Inez was there, the president of the college was a man named Taylor. I'm quoting here, the last of a line of Baptist ministers to head Vassar. He held the office between 1886 and 1914, during which time he did much to develop the academic strength of the college by, among other things, appointing capable faculty, many of them women. He believed firmly that their college years students should pursue their studies in disinterested tranquility, freed from the demands for political or social commitment. And when, after the turn of the century, debate over issues of social reform increasingly intruded into college preserve, Taylor laid down a rigid policy against public discussion of controversial issues on campus. He also spoke out against the ideology of reform, and in 1909 composed a speech which he then had printed and circulated, entitled "The Conservatism of Vassar." In it, he said that Vassar College recognizes all good service as worthy. It scouts the common opinion of the undergraduate and declares that it be unhealthful intellectually and socially. It affirms its belief in the home and in the old-fashioned view of marriage and children, and the splendid service of society wrought through the quiet and unradical means. A liberal women's college affirms the belief in the home and in the old-fashioned view of marriage and children. Inez didn't fit in very well with that. Well, she was in London. She was involved with several organizations seeking the right for women to vote there. And when she got to Vassar, she organized groups to talk about suffrage. She was told that they could not meet on the Vassar campus. And so she moved to the cemetery across the street. And there she held rallies and lectures. 67% of the students of Vassar attended those events. By 1916, almost all the major suffrage organizations were united behind the goal of a constitutional amendment. And when President Wilson changed his position in support of the amendment, the political balance began to shift. On May 21st, 1919, the House of Representatives passed the amendment, and 2 weeks later, the Senate followed. And when Tennessee became the 36th state to ratify the amendment on August 18, the amendment passed its final hurdle. And Secretary of State Bainbridge Colby certified the ratification on August 26, 1920, changing the face of American electorate forever. But back to Inez. She became a famous suffragist. And part of it began in 1913 when there was a women's suffrage procession in Washington, D.C. And she led that parade riding a white horse with a white robe and crown. She became a lawyer, a labor lawyer primarily, a socialist, a World War I correspondent, a public speaker. She defied the school that she attended's meeting ban. She got speakers. She was active in the suffrage movement across the country, giving speeches. In Washington, D.C., she famously posed the question to President Wilson, "Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty?"